Welcome to Reddit Aliens. What is a dark, creepy true story that not many people know about? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Nobody knows about this story, but I will tell you, Reddit. This is about my uncle. I think it was the late 70s or 80s. I can't remember which, but my uncle is old. He's like 50 now. Ugh. Anyway, he took a trip to the Grand Canyon with his friends. They were driving along the Grand Canyon and stopped near this area with hedges or brush on the side of the canyon and decided to take one of your standard funny Grand Canyon pictures. They had a really funny idea. My uncle was to stand on the side of the canyon with a fishing rod and pretend to fish off the side of the canyon. So, they ended up taking the picture and shortly after packed up and drove off. So, they took the role to the developed, and when they saw the picture, they noticed something very strange. In the picture, not far behind my uncle, was a man dressed in all black with pale white skin, standing there in the brush, just staring at the camera with a knowing smirk on his face. He said he and his two friends were in that spot for about 15 minutes. My uncle and his friends claimed that they did not know this man, that they were the only ones in that spot, and the Grand Canyon was vacant of tourists at this time of year. They still know nothing about the man, and the picture still exists. I will post it if there is enough demand. I have to find it first. I think it's on my Facebook or something. Post it. I have relatives, my grandfather's cousin to be precise, who live in Ukraine, not far from the Chernobyl zone of alienation, aka place what is lethally radioactive. One day, they were at the market and found a stall selling produce. The most impressive were a large store of very large, very ripe blueberries. They bought them all up. Instead of eating the berries immediately, they decided to can them. Now, radiation is still a problem through most of Ukraine. Most families have a water purifier that will make questionable water safe to drink, though it takes a few hours. The mother got up in the middle of the following night to get a drink of water from the purifier in the kitchen when she noticed something seemed to be reflecting light in the pantry. Curious, she investigated. It wasn't a reflection. Those jars of big, ripe blueberries were just radioactive enough to glow in the middle of the very dark night. It is in the German memoir Sniper on the Eastern Front. The story I'm about to tell gives me chills even to this day, and I think about it often. It is March 1945, and the Germans have been pushed back by the Russians into Germany and Czechoslovakia. He was scouting some German village in student land. A Russian platoon drove around, so he hid in a caved-out building, so this lone sniper had a front row seat to the horror to what was to follow. The platoon was plundering the village until it ran into this German couple. The Russians then tied up the husband and forced him to watch as the Russians, in order of ranking personnel, raped the wife, one by one. She was screaming in agony, fell in and out of consciousness, and was in so much pain. When the last Russian was finished with her, he shoved a flare gun up the woman's vagina and fired it. The woman screamed out the most animalistic, brutal, and haunting scream the German has ever heard. As the flare was slowly burning, the woman's insides and blood and flare residue flames were rushing out of her body, and then she slumped over dead. German reinforcements soon arrived and killed and wounded the platoon, and the husband went into the house, grabbed an object, I recall it was a shovel, and hacked the remaining wounded Russians on the ground until they were all dead. Some of the Germans tried stopping him, but the lone sniper held him back. Eerily timely, but here goes. Most people think that Newton or Virginia Tech was the worst incident of mass murder at a U.S. school. They're wrong. Andrew Keough's neighbor described him as an intelligent but impatient man. More quietly, they spoke of how he had beaten one of his horses to death in a fit of rage when it failed to meet his expectations. His reputation for thriftiness earned him the role of treasurer of the school board in Bath, Michigan, but the other members soon found him difficult to work with. By 1926, his wife became ill with chronic tuberculosis. The cost of her treatments had put a strain on the couple's finances, but Keough blamed the school superintendent. Around the same time, he ran for the position of town clerk, which he had been temporarily filling, but was soundly defeated. He took this as a personal rejection by the people of Bath and began to make strange remarks, telling a bus driver he was delivering a paycheck to, "My boy, you want to take good care of that check, as it is probably that last check you will ever get," or warning a teacher that if she wanted a picnic, she would better have it at once. On the morning of May 18, 1927, Keough set off firebombs that he had set across his property. He then packed his truck full of pyritol, a repurposed World War I incendiary explosive, and dynamite, and drove into town, telling firefighters arriving at the scene, "Boys, you're my friends. You better get out of here. You better head down to the school." 15 minutes after classes began in the Bath Consolidated School, an alarm clock went off, detonating a stockpile of explosives that Kehoe had hidden there in the basement over the course of months, using his position as a school handyman. The initial blast killed 38 people, collapsed the entire north wing of the school, trapping more in the rubble. Half an hour later, as townspeople had flocked to the school to try and rescue students and teachers from the wreckage, Kehoe pulled up. When he saw the superintendent there, he waved him over, confessed to the bombing. Kehoe then said, "I'll take you with me," and fired the rifle he was carrying into the back seat, detonating the explosives there and killing 7 more people, including himself. Investigators found several things when they examined his farm later. He had girdled all of his trees to kill them, cut all his fences, and wired the legs of his horses together so he couldn't be rescued from the fire. They found his wife beaten to death. They found a sign with the words "Criminals are made, not born" stenciled on it and tied to the fence. And finally, they found unused farm equipment in his barn that, if he had sold it, would have relieved his financial burden. Centralia, Pennsylvania. It was a pretty decent-sized coal mining town, and in the 60s, a fire, which I believe was started at a landfill but was not put out completely, caught an exposed coal vein on fire, and the fire burns underground to this day. In the 80s, the government started paying people to leave and buying up all the land and destroying the houses so no one could live there. Since they didn't exactly force people to leave, the town still has a population of about 10. There's enough coal underground to keep the fire burning for a very long time. I've been there before, and in person it is really eerie. It's a bunch of empty streets with 1 or 2 houses, a church, and some cemeteries. One part of the highway, which was closed off and rerouted because of the fire, is all cracked and misshapen, so the road is really uneven. One of the weirdest things is the steam that comes out through the ground. It almost looks like little hot springs everywhere, but it's really all coming from the fire below. As a veteran and American and just human, this story outrages me, and I'm sorry for that family. When I was in the military, they were giving out the smallpox vaccines. This was around 2002-2003, and there were side effects. Not many people suffered from them, but a few got some bad issues from it. One I particularly remember was an E3 who got the shot and soon after started getting sick hardcore. I'm talking like he would get the common cold and would be out for days and in and out of the hospital often when he got sick. This happened enough after a couple of months that they made me escort him to a larger base where they had better medical facilities so they could run tests. Turns out, his body reacted to the smallpox vaccine like no way they had ever seen. Basically, he had lab-created AIDS. It wasn't able to be transmitted sexually, only by blood transfusion, so he was relatively safe to be around. They gave him a life expectancy of someone with full-blown AIDS, somewhere between 3 to 5 years. Needless to say, this depressed the hell out of him, He had a 2-year-old daughter and had only been married for a few years at this point. But here's the kicker. A few days after I turned in the report to my command, they made me escort him again to the medical facility so they could do a psych eval on him, so they could discharge him on a prior existing medical condition, thus ensuring they would not have to pay him or his family restitution for the medical condition he got while in the military. This is why I got out of the military with an honorable discharge before my 4 years were up. How? I told them that what they did was effed up and they should do something about it. I spent my last months sitting at a radio as a non-rated petty officer until they could get the paperwork filed and boot me out. I'm sorry I had to bear witness to this, and I'm sorry there was nothing I could do at the time. I was naive at the time and just followed orders. I understand. The DeFeo family murders. 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo shot his parents and 4 siblings in their sleep before later being declared insane after claiming that he heard voices in the house. The massacre happened in Amityville, New York, and the next family to live in the DeFeo house moved out after a month, citing strange paranormal disturbances. That family's story became the basis for the novel and the film The Amityville Horror, and whether or not you believe the account to be true, the DeFeo murders were gruesome nonetheless. Live 20 minutes from there. When Vlad the Impaler was about to be invaded, he, true to his title, impaled hundreds of peasants on his country's border so that his attackers would see how ruthless he was. It worked, and the invaders turned back and went home. Historians believe Vlad's penchant for impaling stemmed from sexual abuse from men while he was a boy. Also, he experimented with different methods of impaling, through various orifices, and in his off time would eat his meals while watching people slowly dying upon their spikes. The Baby P story really effed with my head. In the UK a couple of years ago, the boyfriend of this woman started beating her son. The things he did were horrific, training his dog to bite him, pulling out his fingernails, toenails, smashing his fingers, throwing him in the air and letting him hit the floor, and tossing him around, calling it roughhousing. The boyfriend eventually did this so hard that one night he snapped Baby P's spine in half. One of the things that stuck with me was when I read that he was trained to be submissive, and when the boyfriend would enter the room, Baby P would automatically put his head to the floor. When I first read about it, I had nightmares for weeks. HiFi murders in Utah. Dale S. Pierre and William Andrews, member of the U.S. Air Force, broke into a home audio shop to rob it and took 5 people hostage. They gave the hostages a blue liquid that they told them was vodka laced with sleeping pills. The victims refused to drink it. The blue liquid wasn't vodka. It was actually Drano that they then forced to drink, which made the victims' flesh peel away and caused severe blisters. They then stomped a pen into one of the hostages' ears. There was a teenage girl held hostage that they raped multiple times, then threw her on her face and shot her in the head. This story here is an example of walking a mile in other people's shoes, or maybe more. I would say Unit 731, but it seems to be on TIL almost every day. So, I guess I'd say this one I heard about this really old lady, thought to be about 101, who lived in a small stone hovel in South America, Chile, I think. She always wore a hood over her head and talked in a shrill, rasping voice. By day, she worked at a meat stall, and by night she would hobble back to her house in her full-length gown. Her skin was grayed and incredibly wrinkled and dry. She looked by most accounts like a witch, and many children in the village feared her. It was only after aid workers came to the village after an earthquake, which left it without supply routes, that they actually examined this old woman and found that the woman's granddaughter was actually wearing her grandmother's skin, and that the grandmother had died from natural causes years ago. The girl, who, if I remember correctly, was about 14 or 15, gutted, bled, and cured the grandmother's corpse and left an opening in the back of the skin that she could climb into. What? Worse still, she had left the skin of the face, cured and intact, and could put her head up inside and fill out the skin on her head and peer out the eye holes, which she enlarged. After being removed from the grotesque suit and asked about the ordeal, she said she did it so she could carry on working because her mother had died, and so she could maintain her status in the community. She also said she enjoyed playing make-believe with the corpse and that the whole process gave her much enjoyment. The girl was thought to have run away years back. However, after the ordeal, which by all accounts was oddly legal, the young girl vanished from the community once more and was never seen again. I woke up at 7 years old, totally naked, with the sole window of my room open, screen placed outside, propped up against the house. I have no memory of what may have happened or how I came to be naked in the middle of the night. I went to my mother in my predicament, who rolled over and told me I was fine. I took her word for it, put some clothes on, and went back to bed. I still have no idea what happened. I do remember her putting the window screen back into its proper place the next day, and nothing else was ever said. My roommate's sister lives in a suburban part of Delaware, right outside of Wilmington. Her neighbor had been experiencing all these weird break-ins for a bit, break-ins where nobody could figure out what had been taken. Finally, one day she comes home and finds a pair of men's boxers on her pillow. To the skeptics, she lives alone. She immediately calls the police and gets the hell out of Dodge, locking her doors before she leaves. The police come with her back to her house and find the door unlocked, meaning the man was almost certainly inside her house when she made the discovery. I've always thought the story of the Children of Hamlin was pretty creepy. The town's records start in the late 1300s with the line, "It is 100 years since our children left us." Basically, Hamlin is where the legend of the Pied Piper comes from. He was a guy who would go around to cities and have the mayor pay him to get rid of all the rats. He would then walk through the streets playing a flute, and all the rats would just follow him out of the city. One day, someone decided not to pay him for getting rid of the rats. So he came back at night, walked through the streets playing his flute, and all of the children followed him out of town, never to be seen again. Obviously, that's not true, but it's based on the Children's Crusade. A boy gathered an army of children, whether or not all of them were actually kids is disputed, but unlikely, to retake the Holy Land. Hamlin is believed to have let their children go on this crusade because they were going broke or something. The army crossed the Alps, commissioned some ships in Venice, and the ships promptly took all the children to Tunisia, where they were sold into slavery. It's not the most WTF story, but I do think it's a little creepy that there was a city out there whose children just up and left. First, I have to apologize because I don't know specifics as far as where exactly this took place or the names of the people involved. My mother has a friend or coworker, can't remember exactly since this was a few years ago she told me, who used to live in Maine. I'm 90% sure it's Maine. Once again, apologies. Who lived next to the family she considered to be normal. A husband, wife, and 2 sons lived there and nothing ever seemed out of place. One day, my mother's friend was sitting in her house and smelled something a little off. The smell was one of those weak smells that don't smell terrible, and it even makes you think that it is just in your head. Fast forward 2 days, and the smell had grown stronger and worse. When she called the authorities, they determined that the smell was coming from the neighbor's house. When they investigated, they discovered that the parents had decided to cook their son in the oven and just leave it on. Who does that? I mean, if it was just one person, you could say that as unfortunate as the situation is, it is insanity. When 2 people conspire, however, that is not insanity. That is something else entirely. I guess you could say that it is pure evil, but I feel like that is too vague a statement. Does anybody know of anything, psychologically speaking or otherwise, that would cause 2 grown adults to do something like this? Maybe it is insanity, but I feel that it would be unlikely in this situation. I don't know, drugs? My parents' friend told me once about a genuine terrifying story that happened to someone at his work. His colleague at work, a woman in her mid-30s, was on holiday in Portugal with her family for the summer. Herself and her daughter were shopping in a supermarket close to the hotel. Just for a second to collect some groceries from the shelves, the mother lets go of the daughter's hand. The mother collects her things and begins to move to the next aisle, and that is when she notices her child is missing. This took place shortly after the Madeleine McCann disappearance. And fully aware that she was in a crowded supermarket, the mother flips out. She starts screaming for her child, that her child is missing, and is so distressed that the store freaks out with her. Shutters come down, alarms are sounded, and the staff begins a search for the girl. They found the girl still alive in the bathroom. Her hair had been cut, and she was wearing a different set of plain clothes. If they had taken but a few seconds more to find her, she would have been gone for good. Thinking about it gives me chills. Now, this is a fascinating story about a town I have visited but knew none of this before. I'm a tour guide in Savannah, Georgia. I tell this story on my historical and haunted tours, and as far as I know, it's all true. Savannah suffered 3 major fires in 1796, 1820, and 1889. Immediately after each fire, yellow fever swept the city. Stagnant water had collected in the foundations of the buildings destroyed by the fires, breeding mosquitoes and spreading yellow fever. The citizens thought the epidemic was airborne, and the seemingly coincidental and devastating events led many to believe the city was cursed. Yellow fever is nasty. It begins like the flu. Children and people with compromised immune systems would often experience liver failure, resulting in jaundice, hence yellow fever. Ultimately, people ended up vomiting blood, which appeared black and reinforced the belief that the city was cursed and that the infected were possessed by demons. Most who made it to this stage of the illness died, but some fell into a coma, which by those medical standards closely resembled death. Because the citizens believed the epidemic to be airborne, they felt it was the utmost importance to bury the yellow fever victims as quickly as possible. Some comatose victims were mistaken for dead and buried alive. The city of Savannah built over most of its cemeteries, and burial records were destroyed in the fires. There have been instances in recent years in which workers have unearthed coffins with scratch marks inside the lids, bodies with broken fingers, etc., and the creepiest part about it is that there have been outbreaks of yellow fever in the past couple years.